welcome to, this is Lucky Day 13, mobile development, text fields, and loops. So, one of the things about text fields, and this is often the case when I start talking about something new, is it's not actually new, right? We've used text fields a few times, and also they're not unfamiliar to you as widgets. You use text fields all the time without necessarily, I don't mean to say that you would know how to program a text field, but you might, and certainly you know what they do and how they work more or less. And so this is just continuing along my my attempt to introduce widgets one at a time, bit by bit, and pair it with some basic programming or scripting topic that seems to pair with it. So the topic we'll tackle in chapter 6 is loops or repetition. Loops or repetition. Loops or repetition. But we'll start out with a text field and learn about it before we get there. So the first thing you want to know about text fields is, although generically we would call a text field a widget, like a button or slider or whatever else, within Solar 2D, they're actually in a different library. They're not in the widget library or table. They're in the native library or table. And you can search online and find reasons for it. Apparently, they're just very difficult to write. And slowly over time, they've worked the kinks out of the text field, but it's still a native object or a native widget. It's not a widget library widget. It also has some usability issues, maybe, is the way to say. And some of these get solved in Corona or Solar 2D updates. So I say the last time I tried to do something with text fields, these are the issues. The main issue, am writing an app that I've been working on that has text fields, and one of the issues is you can add them to display groups, but they don't always honor what you do to display groups. So if you hide a display group or send it to the front or send it to the back, more often than not, text fields that are part of the display group just don't do anything. They just stay on top. So just be aware that if the app you guys are going to tackle for your team project needs text fields, just be aware that they're a little bit of a pain. But let's dive in. I don't mean to be too harsh. They do, in general, they do work. They work well. They allow the user to type in data that you want to use in your app. It could be text data. It could be numeric data. You can actually customize what keyboard pops up, when the user taps into the text field, based on the input type that you specify. I show you the syntax here just to make explicit again that we are not looking at a widget library widget. So you can see the syntax here is native new text field. If you're using Draw to Code, I've put text fields in the widget palette and in the add object area to the left, because obviously conceptually there are widgets, and it didn't make sense to have a separate native table and to separate text field out. I think if you're programming your app and you want to add a text field, it makes sense to go to the widget palette and pull it out of there. Just know that behind the scenes it is a native object, not a widget object. Other than that, in Draw to Code, when you add the text field, it gets hooked up to the listener. You get an event handler function. The event that it listens to is called user input. So the handler functions are called by the text field object number, so object 1, and then user input handler. And you get a default snippet, as you do in all the other widgets, that gives you some initial reporting on what's going on with the widget, and also obviously examples of the syntax you would use to get data out of the widget and use it for your own purposes. As usual, the order of these is the way they need to be ordered in your stack, in that the text field needs to be below the event handling function that it's tied to. So you can move the stuff around in your stack, certainly. That's what the up and down arrows are for. But you want to you'll want to be careful when doing any of the widgets that you keep the order correct. And at least conceptually to me, in most cases, it makes sense to pair them up and keep them paired up in terms of their location in your stack. In other words, I would want to keep my stack so that my widget is directly below the event handler that's tied to it. That makes it way easier for me in my stack to see what snippet I need to be working on. And if I get lost in a huge stack, I can click on the widget and draw in a code, and it'll find it in the stack, and then I know it's this snippet right here is the one I need to open and work on. Okay, so the settings panel or the details panel. I'm sorry, I flip-flop back and forth. Sometimes I call it the settings panel, but I label it the details panel. I'm not sure what the best term is, but the panel in which all the settings for objects are for the text field, I've got that displayed here in the keynote. So you have a lot of control over it. You can specify the font, text color, alignment, obviously position. However, there are certain things that, although they do work when you test it on a device, they don't work in the Solar 2D simulator. So for instance, there is an option to select the text so that when the user taps in the text field, all of the text is selected, which is often very handy. That does not work in the simulator, so don't get frustrated if you think you should be seeing it, because you won't. So you can switch between the input types just by tapping that input type button, and it'll loop through each of the different input types. What that will do on the device is it tells it what kind of data you can enter and which keyboard to pop up. However, in the simulator, it doesn't pop up a keyboard. There is no simulated keyboard. Instead, you use your keyboard on your development computer to input the data. All right, the text field actually has 3 phases. So this is a lot like, for instance, buttons or touch, which have 3 phases. The 3 phases are began, submitted, and ended. And obviously began is when the user taps into the text field. So the text field gets focus and a cursor. And on an actual device, the keyboard would slide up from the bottom at that point. And then submitted and ended are pretty much the same. Submitted is in the simulator when you hit the return key or the enter key after entering data. Ended just means that the text field has lost focus, which also typically occurs when you dismiss the keyboard in some manner. So in lots of the handling code, we'll lump submitted and ended together to mean that if we want to read data out of that text field, we can now read data out of the text field. And when it's ended or submitted, I think we'll also dismiss the on-screen keyboard and have it slide away. All right, this is just a flowchart of the logic that we'll use, or a simplification of the logic that we'll use to handle events, so that when the user does something with the text field, we jump to the user input handler function, and then we'll have some if-then logic to deal with which phase it is. If you wanted to, you could keep track of the users typing as they type. If every character mattered to you, you could do that. Otherwise, we just focus on began and ended, submitted phases. This is very close. We'll do it in just a second, but this is going to be very close to the actual snippet in drawn to code that you'll get as the default snippet. And again, you can delete the default snippet or comment it out and just use it as a reference, but it's a good reference to show you how to parse out what phase you're in. The phase is event.phase, and then also how to get the text out of the text field. So the text in the text field is event.target.text. And that's if you want to pull it out live or when it's submitted. In some cases, in some UIs, you don't care. There will be several text fields, and you don't care about what they're typing as they're typing, and you don't care about when they move to the next text field. You only care about when they hit the next button at the bottom of the screen, or the submit button, or whatever the case, the done button, whatever the case may be. Lots of times we'll write the code so that we don't really pay a lot of attention to typing in individual text fields, but we pay attention to when the user says they're done, then we go through and grab all the text out of the text fields. So a little bit of a tangent here. We covered if-then logic in Chapter 5. There is no if-then script object in drawn code at this point. So to do logic, there are two approaches that are easy: the convert to snippet and the surround with snippets approach. And we've used the surround with snippets approach, I think, every time so far. So I thought, let me give you an example of the other approach so that you can weigh the differences between them and decide if one of them is better in a certain circumstance or not. So the convert to snippet approach involves the description I have here is just one way to do it. You select the object in the stack. You can go to the generated code window then and highlight that code or a portion of that code that you want and copy it from the generated code window and then paste it in the place you want to put it. Alternatively, if you just want the entire script object, you don't want to copy a bit out of it, you can select the script object in the stack and then pull down the edit menu at the top of the screen and choose copy snippet code. And then you're also left with the issue that still leaves the script object in your code. So you have a copy of the code that it generates, but then you also have the script object. So you have to either remove the script object from the code by unchecking its checkbox, or delete it. Or if you're sure you don't want to have it as a script object in the future, you can, instead of selecting copy script object code, the other edit option is to convert the script object into a snippet. So that's another easy way to do this convert to snippet approach. But the bottom line is, in the end, you have the code either in its own snippet or on the clipboard for you to paste it into a snippet where you want to use it. So I've got just a follow along activity that we'll do to hopefully illustrate some of this stuff. So we're going to create an app with two text fields, and when the user enters data in the text fields, we're going to add those two text fields up and display the result. So I'll try to stick to my variable names here. So there'll be number 1, number 2, and total. So I'm going to start drawing the code. Okay, so we're going to make an app with two text fields, and we're going to add the results together. So we'll head to the widget, add object palette, and text fields way down here. So I'm going to need 2 of them. And the exact placement and stuff obviously isn't super critical. I do need some display objects though, so I want some text. Let's say at least 2. The bottom one will be the total, and the middle one will just be the plus sign. Since they're numbers, I'm going to switch the text fields over to numeric. I guess they could be decimal. So let me go back to decimal. What else? Well, let's look at the stack. So I've just added a bunch of stuff to the stack, but Drawn to Code's created everything we need to work with this. So you'll see, even though we haven't done a lot in the stack, we've got the 2 text fields. Each of them has their own input handler with default snippets in it. So let's save it and run it and see where we're at. So chapter 6, and this is activity 1. The code is here, and I'm going to save it and run it. Okay, so we've got default text. If I click in there, and I'll change it to a 0 next, but what you'll see is as we start typing, you get some information down here. So if I typed 22 and hit return, what you should see at the console is submitted 22, or whatever it is you typed in. This is not doing any math. This is just the default text fields with their handlers and the default event parsing code in Drawn to Code, just spitting out data about what you're doing. So a couple changes. I'm going to switch the alignment over to the right because numbers are normally right justified. And I'm going to change what's in them to zeros. So nothing Nothing earth-shattering there. If you're playing around with it, feel free to change the font or maybe make them less wide or whatever suits your artistic sensibility. So then the question is, if we want to add those numbers together, how do we do that? And I don't mean, obviously we use the plus operator. That's not what I'm asking. It's where do we do it? Where do we put the code? So we want to add whatever the user's entered in when they submit the text field, but I don't have a button to trigger that. So I could have a button that said, do the math, or I can listen to each of the text fields, and whenever they submit either one, I can grab whatever's in them and add it together and display it, which is probably the way to do it. That does mean, though, if I do that, I would have essentially duplicated code in both of the user input handlers, which I don't like. Redundant code is a breeding ground for mistakes and bugs. So I'm going to create a function. So I'm heading to the functions palette, and I'm going to create a new function. I'm going to move the function up as well, and I'm going to rename the function. New function's not really what it needs to be named, so I'm going to call it, how about calculate? You can call it whatever you want, obviously, just any valid Lua identifier. You want to keep the parentheses and the parameter, not that I have any plans to use it, but I might in the future, and that leaves me a handle for a future parameter that I might want to add. And so this is the new function layout. Says essentially this is the function body. These are the little bits of insertion code that I add. You can edit in here if you really want to, but I've provided you with a snippet now, which is where you should put your code. That said, even if you edit here, it should work fine now. In any event, what we want to do is, well, we're going to call calculate in both of the user input handlers, but let's just focus on the code. So to get this to work, we now won't have access to the event table. Although you could pass the event table as the parameter, but I think it's easier just to directly reference the text fields. So if you hover over them, you can see they're object 1 and object 4. So I want to grab the two numbers out. So I called them in the keynote number 1 and number 2, I believe. So I'm going to say it's object1.text. So the issue may be, or that may crop up, is that's not a number, right? It's text. So if I want to make sure it's treated as a number by Lua, I'm going to put it in this toNumber function. All right, so I've got number 1. Let's grab number 2. So number 2 is number 2 equals toNumber object 4.text, and then total equals number 1 plus number, why do I keep doing that, number 2. So if you're playing at home, your code should look something like this. So now I've got let's start by just printing that out. Print total equals total, and this will give us a chance to test to see whether the math is working and everything's hooked up properly. Spoiler alert, it's not, but I want to show you it's not. So here's the two numbers. So I'm going to say 2.5 and 6. I'm going to hit return, and you can see nothing was summed, and there's no total out at the console. The text fields are working. You can see it sees that I typed in the 2.5, and it sees that I typed in the 6. It just hasn't added them together. So why is that? Well, it's mainly because we haven't called our function. We have a calculate function, but we haven't used it. So we want to use it. So let's head back to the stack and get into our object 3 snippet and our object 6 snippet. Here's the first one. So this is the default snippet for the first text field, and it's responsible for producing the information that's spelled out to the console every time the user does something in the text field. We don't really care in terms of the math, though, about most of this, but what we want to do is deal with when they submit the text field. So we know where they submit in the logical structure because I put a print statement there that says text submitted, right? So you could leave that or get rid of it, but this is the area that we want to be in right here, which is in our logical structure in the event phase equals ended or submitted. There is a check here, though, to make sure that they have typed something. If they delete everything in the text field and then hit return, they've essentially submitted a nil. And then if we try to do math with a nil, we'll get a nil exception, which is ugly. So I do check that it's non-nil before I move on and do anything. So here's where I want to do the math, but I've written a function to do the math. So I don't need to do the math, I just call the function. And like I said, if you wanted to, you could pass it the event table. If there was something in the future we wanted to do that was the same for both of the text fields, and we wanted to know which text field had been, submitted, then the event table would tell us which we could get that information out of the event table. All I've done is add what is for me line 39, which is a call to the calculate function that we wrote. I'm going to move to the other snippet, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. I want to be here, and I want to say calculate, and I'll pass it the event table from here as well. So all that does is exactly what we did with the other one. It does the math, and in the future, if we wanted to react to the nature of the event in some way, the source of the event in some way, then we could have that in our calculate function as well because we've passed it that data. All right, let's save it. See if I've made a mistake. All right, so in testing, I'm gonna enter two numbers. Here's 2.5 and here's 5.25. Okay, so if you're watching, you'll see it's still 0, but that's expected because I haven't set that text display object yet. The test at this point just should calculate the total and display it at the console, which if you're following along, you should see at your console total equals 7.75, or if you didn't enter the same numbers I did, you should see a correct total at the console. So that means everything's working. All we have to do now is head back to our snippet in the calculate function, and instead of just printing it to the console, let's go ahead and update the on-screen number, which is object text. So you guys know how to do that. It's object8.text equals total. All right, let's test it. I have high hopes. 5.5 and, I don't know, 9.0. Hey, there we go. So it's still at the console just for debugging purposes, but now we see on screen we have the correct total. So this should be a pretty robust version. A bit of a risk, but if I enter nothing and hit return, oh, all right, I have to work on that. I'm going to edit this out of the recording, obviously. So it says number one's a nil value. Tap to perform arithmetic on a nil value. I'll have to see why my snippet's not handling that. It's obviously designed to handle that. Let's jump back to the keynote, though. So the next step is to do a little activity, but I want to leave that for you guys to do for a bonus galleon if you want to. So the activity is just to do a little bit of logic. I would do it inside of the calculate function, and just see if the total is, I say here, above 90. If so, display an A. If it's between 80 and 90, say B. If it's less than that, I mean, you can go as far as you want. You can figure out C and D and F if you want, or you can just figure out A and B and then say, better luck next time on your next app as a message. It's worth an extra galleon on top of the quiz, the 3 galleons for the quiz. What we're going to tackle next time is loops. It's actually a pretty big topic in and of its own. I don't know that we'll get through it all in one session, but we will dive into loops, and we will do some fun stuff. But the basic idea is how do you do the same code over and over. That's also called repetition. And actually, that will be our first opportunity to use the convert to snippet approach. So I'll do it in class when we write the first of our loops. All right, then there's quiz 13 is up. It's not due till before class next time, and the bonus galleon activity also will be due before class next time if you wanna tackle it. If you already have too many galleons and it's getting burdensome to manage that much virtual currency, then certainly don't feel like you have to do it. It is entirely optional. That's all I want to cover for the class. I'll see you next time.